Okay. And if you could, if anybody's got a sort of name like sort of iPad or something like that, could you change it to your full name so that people can know who you are, and we may want to contact each other afterwards. So, are there any questions about any procedures before we kick off? Okay, well, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's David Lyon, who is Professor Emeritus at Queen's University, Canada. He's an internationally renowned scholar of surveillance practices from both sociological and theological perspectives. And so we're all looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say, David. So over to you.
Well, thank you for your kind welcome. I've been invited to speak about surveillance this evening, and what a huge topic. And it's one that I've discovered to be pretty difficult to manage, as I've been looking at it for the last 4 decades and more. Perhaps if I start with a local, that is local to me, story, then we can get into the topic in an everyday and I hope understandable way. Then what I'm going to do is fill in a bit of surveillance history before commenting on a couple of current developments in surveillance that draw on so-called machine learning and artificial intelligence. They have to do with public events that have police presence, so there's a connection with your interests here. And they involve the use of augmented video surveillance at the Paris Olympics and the testing of facial recognition systems for crowd control by the London Metropolitan Police. And then lastly, I'll take the opportunity to comment on some current research that fills out the history of surveillance by looking at the early medieval period that was very different from what we experience today. And I've come to believe that such surveillance depended on some now long neglected practices that offer the basis for surveillance critique for today. Now, I'm assuming that the slides that I sent will be appearing, and so it's time for the first one. Do you see the slide? Ah, there we go. Okay, and that's just the title slide, so we can move to the main slide.
Is this the one, David?
Yeah, that is the one. But right now I'm just trying to reduce the screen size so I can get back to my own screen. There we go. Got it. Okay, so here's the story then. I want you to know, I think we've got the third slide there. Is there not one that comes before that? There you go. I want to tell you about James McLeod, an Ottawa resident who installed Tim Horton's mobile ordering app on his smartphone. After using it for a while to pick up his breakfast coffee and bagel, he became suspicious that it knew more about him than was needed for his breakfast order. A Freedom of Information request resulted in his discovering that, in fact, its geolocation software knew all sorts of things, like his girlfriend's address, when he attended a Toronto Blue Jays game, when he went on vacation through Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands en route for Morocco, and that while there he drifted close to a competitor coffee house in Marrakesh. Now, the Canadian Federal Privacy Commissioner investigated this, concluding that a gross infringement of privacy had occurred. But Tim Hortons incurred no fine. However, MacLeod himself made no comment about those data being sold to other companies or even government departments, which is how surveillance capitalism works, for their use and without his knowledge, or about the scoring and ranking of all of our lifetime value, which in turn divisively affects our everyday life chances and choices. Nor did MacLeod seem aware that companies deliberately use tactics to placate, divert, mislead, and confuse consumers so that they feel helpless and resign themselves to the data gathering. So worrying about the NSA might be one thing. Even more concerning perhaps is Tim Hortons or Amazon. And I share that story because it reminds us that our everyday phone and online activities are constantly monitored for purposes that are basically opaque to us, but which have non-trivial consequences. And also that these corporate activities are often deliberately obscured when they should be transparent, to give a false sense of security to users who, like James MacLeod, take no further steps to discover what are the real purposes of the platforms. But I don't want you to imagine that such an example covers all surveillance matters today. There are many specific technologies and systems, for example, those used by security services and police that are highly surveillant, but aren't part of the platform-based surveillance that is immediately familiar to us. So let me say a little bit about dataveillance here. To get a handle on contemporary surveillance, we have to be careful about defining what we mean by surveillance. New slide. And by surveillance, I mean the focused, systematic, and routine attention to personal details for the purposes of influence, management, protection, and direction. I've included a few references on the slides, and this one is freely available online. It's a discussion of ways in which we define surveillance in Internet Policy Review. Dataveillance is a handy word, reminding us that surveillance is now done primarily by using digital data. Even seeing or watching is achieved not by human eyes, but by digital photographic means. And I'll refer to an example of automated facial recognition systems popular in some police forces to make this point. But let me first review a kind of standard story of how surveillance developed in modern times. The use of the concept of surveillance, including its adverse aspects, particularly since the 19th century, is no accident. This was a period when industrial capitalism came into its own, involving new modes of organization and governance, both within emerging national and colonial governments, and in new forms of economic life, like in production and consumption. So from the first, such usage of the term surveillance, while direct participation was never abandoned, the technologies of surveillance were also important, entailing as they do ways of enhancing first vision and then hearing and eventually memory. For example, improved lighting in the streets of Paris to enhance visibility was a policing priority back in 1668. In the 1890s, San Francisco newspapers were complaining about telephone operators listening in on conversations, a practice soon followed, of course, by other players. And while Thomas Edison promoted the surveillance use of his phonograph as a way of enhancing memory, he hadn't thought about using it for music yet, that was in 1877, Edward Higgs notes that in Europe, the state administrative collection and thus memory of citizen data had already been well underway since the 1500s. However, from the mid-20th century onwards, the age of Orwell, if you like, surveillance itself was increasingly construed as a threat to freedom and liberty, not only when it was used to buttress Nazism and authoritarian communism, but also in Western democracies with their burgeoning bureaucracies. And this negative connotation of the concept, including the surreptitious concealment of the means that were used by watchers, is the source of much social criticism. If we change the slide, you see here the inside of a gramophone loudspeaker from the 1960s. This was given to me as a gift by one of my postdocs many years ago. And it contains a hidden camera. It was used by the Boulder, Colorado Police Department, and you'll see that some company called Crim, can't read it myself, Crim something or other, produced it. But of course, being the 1960s, it was entirely mechanical. And so there were little switches inside that had an automated means of switching from a timed means of switching from one part of the film to the next. So early surveillance in the electrical age, if you like. So there's a concealed use of surveillance in government, which also happens in workplaces and, of course, in the marketplace. And that is seen increasingly strongly in the later 20th century onwards, making the concept and actual practice of surveillance politically contentious. Increasingly, from back in the 19th century, it was the technologies used for surveillance that helped to define inherent changes in the modes of surveillance that in turn require constant rethinking of the concept itself. Those technologies themselves, products of desires for improved communication, industrial production, or military prowess, became merged in the later 20th century in what was called information technology, and latterly in the internet, social media, and other platform companies in the 21st. Most recently, algorithmic analysis of extremely large data sets, artificial intelligence, and machine learning underlie many supposedly smart surveillance activities, from fitness, wearables, to smart homes and cities. There's a new slide. In this one, you see the Ring doorstep surveillance system from Amazon, invented, ironically, to watch for vulnerable deliveries, no doubt from Amazon. Once police departments got wind of such data in the United States, this ended up producing the largest ever private policing system in the world. Anyway, this is why the concept of surveillance is not only required for, but central to the digital context. The former has developed symbiotically with the latter. However, like its context, the digital and the commercial, the practices of surveillance are means to other ends rather than representing human purposes in their own right. This may be demonstrated in each context where surveillance as social practices appear, which is why the practices are frequently controversial and the concept itself contested. The political economic context and its accompanying technological features have always been significant aspects of whatever surveillance is practiced. To neglect them is to misunderstand both the phenomenon and the concept. And this is clearer today than it's ever been. Think of the term surveillance capitalism. So today, the digital context, dependent on the internet and on complex algorithms, is central to surveillance. There's a new slide. Data, in other words, is the means whereby human beings in their many activities are made visible, represented, and treated. And again, I've given you the reference there in case you want to check it out. It's a free online journal. However, the role played by corporate players has expanded rapidly, such that once again, political economy and technology cannot be ignored. And at the same time, consumer compliance and online self-exposure is the parallel practice. They go together and cannot be ignored. I had a little book a few years ago called The Culture of Surveillance, in which I discussed that connection. Surveillance capitalism remains just that, a phenomenon dependent upon capitalist social relations. It's a contemporary feature of corporate activity that exploits ordinary consumers and device users by collecting, analyzing, and using their personal data for commercial gain. Shoshana Zuboff's blockbuster on surveillance capitalism contains a fascinating expose of how Google first cornered the market of personal data. It focuses in the end on the plight of the sovereign consumer, rather than on the mechanisms of this new form of capitalism that aims for monopoly power, is dependent on precarious workers, resists regulation, and exploits everyday users of internet platforms in invidious ways that ultimately increase their vulnerability. While surveillance capitalism has its very palpable effects in the consumer realm, it has become a major feature too of, for example, political contests. Think of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook in the first election of Donald Trump to the US presidency, and in the results of the Brexit referendum. Although in the realm of political decision-making, we can see how this also operates. In Canada, we have seen government enthusiasm and encouragement of smart city development, such as sidewalk labs that was supposed to be built on the Toronto waterfront, in which the key player was Google through its parent, Alphabet, and a key public issue became the straightforward one of whose data are they? Whose data are being used in this so-called smart city? Alphabet assumed that they would have privileged access to all the data generated. And during the pandemic, Canadians were, in another example, Canadians were shocked to discover that the Public Health Agency of Canada had bought the mobile data of 33 million Canadian citizens, presumably to monitor the path of the virus without any public consultation. So there's a thumbnail sketch of some notions about surveillance capitalism. Let me use a couple of examples now that are connected with surveillance capitalism but don't come out of them. The challenges in relation to AI, and I'm thinking of facial recognition here. And as we can hardly be unaware, AI is the current buzzword and is the topic of global conversations about new trends in technological development, some of which are lauded as saviors, while others are seen as major threats to human flourishing. However, of course, the challenges of AI are understood in quite different ways by different groups. My colleague will be speaking about AI as well, so I'm not going to dwell too long on this. I see various groups who are raising questions that relate to surveillance in strong or weaker ways. So you have the fearful, perhaps, being those who see Frankenstein-style monsters arising in a world out of control. AI applications in which AI becomes self-perpetuating and develops autonomously. But I think there are some very real fears here. And if you look in just one area, the military domain, for example, one does see some very ominous signs. For example, in the use of AI software today in very small and inexpensive drones, or in target generation systems such as Lavender, currently in use in Gaza and no doubt in Lebanon too. The startup culture that produces these companies that are in the world of small drones using AI frequently uses phrases common to California: move fast and break things. And when you think that these are in a military context, it seems to me that they are highly problematic, to say the least. Especially when war, according to former US Chair of Military Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley, says will increasingly depend on so-called autonomous weapon systems and powerful algorithms. And then there is the skeptics, and these are people that come with more of a philosophical view to AI, considering the capacity of AI in different domains, arguing variously that AI simply cannot achieve the goals claimed for it, or that there are species or category or errors involved, such that it doesn't count philosophically either as artificial or intelligent. And of course, the debates have ramped up since the introduction of ChatGPT. But these tell us more about the dangers of believing that these machines are truly intelligent, as humans are intelligent, just because such systems produce risks that are far from artificial. But the group that I want to think about a little bit more are what I think of as the humanizers, who are concerned that the potential for human flourishing may be constrained, if not reversed, by the unabated use of AI. Such would conclude that, for example, social injustice is likely to increase in an AI-influenced world. For example, studies of digital divides, including some very recent ones, show a worsening of access to basic necessities in the contexts where AI is used. Also, exploitative forms of work exist at all stages in the AI pipeline. And this is something that is not so frequently mentioned. This occurs from the mining sector to the software side, where distributed workforces are paid minimal. They're paid minimally for the microtasks that they perform. Workers do the repetitive tasks that the backstop claims of AI magic, but they rarely receive credit for making the systems function. And then in another contested area, it's been shown that AI has a deleterious effect on the climate crisis. Kate Crawford, for example, notes that pursuing AI solutions at the current rate is simply unsustainable, given the massive dependence on data farms and the very large-scale processing needed, not to mention the mining of gold for components, which is prominently found in the Amazon, and the extraction of rare earths that generate massive toxic waste. But a third approach would be one that indicates the sheer unsuitability of the tool for the task. And here one could think of parole, decision-making in prison services, or in another area, the use of automated medical diagnosis, where physicians may use handheld, may just use their phone, in fact, for checking a diagnosis while in discussion with a patient. And those kinds of systems frequently are far less reliable than they should be, as again, a former postdoc of mine discovered. They often depend on racist understandings of the medical literature, rendering them pretty unfit for certain sensitive undertakings. In one well-researched area, facial recognition technologies dependent on AI, many questions are raised. This was seen in the legalizing of algorithmic video surveillance for, new slide here, for the Paris Games in 2024. It's part of a long story of Olympic security surveillance that began in earnest in 1972 at the Munich Olympics, when 11 Israeli athletes were killed by the Black September group. The fear of such violence at prominent mega events, together with the insistent pressure from digital corporations, has prompted a steady and expanding growth of security surveillance, now boosted by AI. And while facial recognition as such was not permitted in Paris, augmented video surveillance was, and this raises many similar questions. The expanded French version uses AI to was using AI to scan the crowds, both on the ground and from drones, to spot any, quote, abnormal or unusual or risky activities. The systems watch the crowd, producing alerts when positions and movements seem atypical. So a body lying down, a body that is not standing, a body that is falling, a body that may be construed as fighting or carrying a weapon may be spotted. But those concerned with civil liberties and human rights are concerned that the very use of such technologies is risky. Amnesty International, for example, is skeptical. They warn that the AI-powered mass surveillance leads to, quote, assaults on rights to privacy, protest, and freedom of assembly and expression. They worry that this will set a precedent for unjustified and disproportionate surveillance in publicly accessible places. For example, cautions Karolina Ivanaska, making judgments on the basis of body movements itself will lead to errors, discrimination, privacy loss, and could compromise fair trials and access to justice. At the same time, not only were the Paris police involved, but public transit agents such as SNCF also had access to video images in the attempt to maintain public order. And I think that the critics are right to be concerned. Olympic security surveillance has become a key testing ground for public space surveillance of many kinds around the world and now over more than 2 decades. The Games act as a kind of global traveling surveillance show where tech companies both conduct real-life experiments and display their newest techniques and technologies. From past experience of many such security games, it is all too easy for the exceptional to become normal. And the trouble with normal, as Bruce Cockburn fans know, is it only gets worse. But I believe that surveillance could get better. And this is what I wanted to share with you this evening. The title chosen for this presentation included the words "a Christian critique," which is fine by me, but may need a little explanation. I do identify with the Christian tradition, particularly, but not exclusively, its Protestant wing. And I've always believed that my academic work should be palpably consistent with and faithful to my deepest commitments. But how this works out may vary too, depending on a number of factors that I don't need to explore in this talk. However, for the last nearly 3 years, I've become increasingly drawn to the idea that history itself provides many resources for considering what might count as a Christian perspective on or critique of contemporary conditions. Having spent several decades researching surveillance, I concluded it was a mistake to which those who study sociology are particularly prone to consider only modern surveillance, and that I should look more closely at medieval surveillance. My research thus far, there's a new slide here, is on the eye of God. And it indicates that early medieval surveillance was based in principles based on Christian commitments and worked out in several different settings, from monastery villages through guilds, legal systems, and other areas of social life. I've included the famous Pontormo painting of Jesus at Emmaus. And why I included it, although it's from the 1500s, 1525, it refers back to this earlier theme of the eye of God, which is seen above the head of the Christ figure in this slide. And I want to show how there are connections here that were worked out in several settings, as I say, through monastery villages, guilds, legal systems, and so on. These themselves began to be secularized from about the 11th century and more decisively after the Enlightenment in the 15th to 18th centuries. They were also increasingly subject to political and technological changes within developing capitalist societies. The result was that they lost their earlier moorings in humanistic outlooks. That is, early medieval surveillance, I'm concluding thus far, was relational, caring, justice-seeking, and reliable. In other words, it contrasts completely with contemporary surveillance that is highly individualistic and encourages individualism, is poorly attuned to basic human needs, is fundamentally unjust in its social sorting features and its contribution to vulnerability and marginalization, and almost completely lacking appropriate accountability, thus eroding trust. And so I want to argue that even in post-Christian settings, these are much closer to the necessary virtues that are badly needed to accompany any kind of surveillance and are worth pursuing as contributions to the rehumanizing of surveillance. And while they might encompass some interests, such as privacy, that are often thought of as antidotes to surveillance, they're far more radical and well-suited to the major challenges emerging in the second quarter of the 21st century. So what was medieval surveillance like? And there's a slide for this quote. Oxford historian Amanda Power writes that the wholesale surveillance of society is nothing new. Until recently, most of the population of Western Europe understood itself to be under scrutiny by an omniscient and omnipotent creator who not only knew the contents of everyone's correspondence, but also the innermost secrets of their hearts. And whole systems of governance, both secular and religious, were based on this view of the universe. I was going to give you another quote as well. I'll leave that out, but we could move the slide. And here is a contemporary figure from the middle of last century. Let me say something about Michel Foucault. Well known for his work on surveillance, especially for introducing Jeremy Bentham's innovative 18th century panopticon to a broad audience. He would have agreed with Amanda Power, whom I just quoted. Bentham's panopticon means all-seeing place and was intended as a rational answer to the horrors of violence and neglect in English prisons. Bentham wanted to turn places of punishment into sites of discipline, where being surveilled by an unseen watcher hidden behind a Venetian blind would oblige prisoners to reform themselves in line with the expectations of the powers that be. Though a rationalist, Bentham appealed to another image that he knew would be familiar to his religious compatriots, the eye of God from medieval times. In the 1970s, Foucault discussed the eye of God as the power of care in the figure of the shepherd who watches over the flock. There's another slide. And this, for Foucault, is a distinctively pastoral view of surveillance that preceded for centuries the eye of God that was cynically present in Bentham's panopticon. Unlike Greek models of gods, the shepherd watches over the flock as it moves. So shepherds are relationally involved with the sheep. Foucault thought of it as a shift from the eye of God to the eye of power. And Foucault quotes the biblical book of Exodus. In your faithful love, you led the people out that you had redeemed, end quote. So pastoral power, Foucault concludes, is, and I've got this quote on a slide, is fundamentally beneficent. Its only raison d'etre is doing good. Its essential object is the salut, the salvation of the flock. It's a power of care. The shepherd is someone who keeps watch to avoid the misfortune that may threaten the least of its members. fascinating to read that in the light of the ways in which surveillance actually operates today. And Foucault continues, the shepherding task is also entrusted to local under-shepherds, the elders or pastors of a church. And Syrian saint John Chrysostom says the bishop should watch over everything, in fact, individuals, the town, and the orbis terrarium, the whole world. And yet it was never a direct political power. Pastoral power didn't become political until the 18th century, asserts Foucault. So the idea of pastoral power for Foucault was introduced into the Western world by way of the Christian church. True, he acknowledges correctly, this church could be creative, conquering, arrogant, bloody. And this strange form of power yet became typical of the West and unique in the history of civilizations. Pastoral power is exercised both in everyday life in the medieval local church and in the wider society, suggests Foucault. Now, had Foucault pressed further into the biblical story of Exodus, he would have noticed that God's eye actually sparked the rescue plan in the first place. Quote, I have surely seen the affliction of my people in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. I've come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians, from Exodus 3. God's eye may thus be also thought of as justice seeking. No wonder the story of Exodus was so central to Jesus' own teachings, or to the work of figures such as Martin Luther King or Desmond Tutu in South Africa. God's eye, fourthly, is reliable and dependable. When pastoral power was transferred to the everyday life in the monastery, Benedict of Cassino's rule ensured the trustworthiness of human eyes watching over other members of the order. The rule was for the corporate life of the village-like monastery. Foucault often mentions the rule of Benedict, focusing on the role of the abbot in overseeing adherence to the rule. Foucault notes that the abbot, quote, represents Christ as the shepherd of the flock, who must dispose all things prudently and justly. The abbot's task, then, was accountable to Christ himself. The reliability of divine watching is assumed, but the development of surveillance among under-shepherds depends on the built-in checks on its power that were listed in the rule. Well, I see my time is up, and I will just say, as I conclude, that I'm trying to argue that modern surveillance mutated not just from early modern roots, but from medieval Christian roots, and that a key cause of mutation was secularization, in the sense that other motivations and motifs began to govern how surveillance was done and for what purposes. So what may be retrieved for surveillance to serve truly human purposes? Well, those four characteristics that I've given you, I think, are really important. There's a slide for them. They are relationality against individualism, caring against supposedly neutral approaches that are amenable to algorithmic reduction, justice orientation against the inherently biased systems of social sorting, and reliable against the untrustworthy and unaccountable, seen both in consumer and security contexts. And these four features are all too often absent from surveillance today. But they could inform our critique of and our alternatives to contemporary surveillance. As I see it, this is not too much to hope for or to work towards. My aim is not to glorify some golden age in the past, because, as we're all aware, it was not such, but to find a guide to human-centered surveillance in the present. Last slide. I just include the little Oxford very short introduction to surveillance that came out this year, and it may be something else that you want to look at if you're interested in thinking further about surveillance. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Certainly, there are some perspectives there that I wasn't aware of, and I think it will be kind of news to a lot of people and really set us thinking. So, we won't take any questions at this stage for you. We'll leave all the questions until the end. So, I'd now like to ask Mike Nellis to speak. And Mike is also a member of Quakers and Criminal Justice, but he also has many other activities, including the work on AI and surveillance. And he's been following the Council of Europe Human Rights recommendations on regulating the potential uses of AI in criminal justice. So we're all looking forward to this, Mike. So over to you.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to put the slides up, Paul, I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. Well, my contribution this evening is a smaller and more specific story than the one that David has given us, but David has provided vital context to all that I'm going to say. Now, the title "Artificial Intelligence, Smart Prisons, and Automated Probation" might sound very science fiction-y. You know, we're really starting to use artificial intelligence, robots in prisons and probation work, you know, is something that we think of in terms of the probation service, a quintessentially humanistic and relational service. Is it really under threat of automation? Is probation really likely to go the way of the gentleman in the photograph, a lamplighter? We do know that technology alters the nature of work, and will probation one day be the kind of job that we only look back at grainy photographs of and wonder what it was all about? So next slide, please. So it's not science fiction at all, in the sense that the Council of Europe has been pondering the question of artificial intelligence.
Excuse me, I don't think that my slide hasn't changed. I don't know if that's the same for other people.
I'm sorry, friends. I have changed the slide. I don't know why you can't see it. And I'm still...
Yes, no, it hasn't changed for me either.
No, me too.
Then I'm afraid I don't know why. To stop sharing and start again. On display. So I'm now on slide starting AI innovation. Can you see that?
No slide at all.
I've also just got a message saying that Zoom has quit unexpectedly, which is, but seems to have come back. Wow. I'll try again to share. Can you now see this slide?
The second one. Thank you. Yes. So
sorry about that.
The Council of Europe has been preoccupied for 6 or 7 years with major questions about how far to go with the innovation of artificial intelligence across all aspects of government and public service, contrasted with how tightly do you regulate it. And to some people, innovation and regulation are two halves of the same coin. To other people, particularly in the tech industry, they're quite oppositional. And the Council of Europe has been wrestling with this. It did work on AI and policing some years ago. It did work on AI and sentencing some years ago. But this year, after 3 years of work, it produced a document about artificial intelligence, prisons and probation, and relating also to the private organizations that deliver services to prisons and probation. It's not the Council of Europe as a whole that produced this, but it was a particular body within the Council of Europe, Council for Penological Cooperation, whose French initials are PCCP, which is a 9-member group of people who assess everything. They've been doing it for 45 years. They assess everything relating to prisons and probation as they operate in the 43 member states of the Council of Europe. They're a very prestigious body in terms of the ethics of prisons and probation across Europe, and they've had influence outside Europe. They devised many rules about humane imprisonment, many rules about humane probation. And so it was not surprising that they would finally turn their attention to artificial intelligence, because this is a major preoccupation of the Council of Europe and indeed the European Union. And over the last 6 or 7 years, there's been an immense amount of reflection relating to the kind of law, kind of ethics, the kind of rules, the kind of procedures that government agencies and commercial bodies should abide by to develop what they call trustworthy, human-centric artificial intelligence, grounded, as you would expect in the European Union and the Council of Europe, in human rights, in the European Declaration of Human Rights. Now, the broader social context of why the Council of Europe and the PCCP have been looking at this is to do with the geopolitical competition particularly between the US, China, and Europe about the use of AI to generate prosperity, security, and well-being in their societies, which don't mean the same things in those societies. But ever since 2018, when major technological advances took place in AI, it had been incremental, and then all of a sudden it was exponential. And from that point onwards, all the major political blocs in the world have been gearing themselves up to become supreme in AI. There's a military dimension to that, which David has already alluded to, but it's not only the military dimension which is governing this competition. So in Europe itself, the World Economic Forum, the think tank of business people and entrepreneurs that meets every year in Davos, back in 2016, preempting some of these movements in 2018, they issued something called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a paper saying that we were already starting to undergo and should go much further with something called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is basically an argument for transforming society using artificial intelligence and biotechnology, upcoming biotechnologies, all led by business with only light touch regulation. That's been a very important framework for thinking about AI in Europe, and both the EU and the Council of Europe have been very influenced by it. Surveillance capitalism, fortunately, I don't have to explain that to you because David has already done that. So thank you, David, for doing that one. Capitalism driven by the gathering, processing, and trading of data for instrumental purposes in governance and commerce. It's the environment in which we all live now. Technopopulism, right, is maybe a newer term, but it's a real thing among political scientists now. The convergence of technocrats who want to promote the greater use of digital technologies in our lives, and populists who want to articulate a more aggressive and emotionally charged response to politics, might once have been seen as the very opposites of each other. One was elitist and focused on experts. One was anti-elitist and focused on so-called common sense. But technopopulism has been coming together via the use of digital media by populist organizations to promote their cause, right? And the getting together of Elon Trump and Donald Musk is the most visible example of technopopulism that you could ever wish to see. But the kind of culture and climate of political development and technological development that's going to create in the US, with presumably knock-on effects around the rest of the world, is something that is germane thinking that's going on about probation and prisons. So next slide, please. So the full title of this document that the Council of Europe has produced, which has a jargony title, CM, that's Council of Ministers, dash recommendation 2024. It's the 5th such recommendation this year. Its title is the ethical and organizational aspects of the use of artificial intelligence and related digital technologies, right? Because there's a spectrum of advanced digital technologies which shade into artificial intelligence, and they want to encompass the digital technologies that aren't necessarily defined as artificial intelligence by prison and probation services. And this document, which was put online on the 9th of October this year, is a vital starting point for anybody who wants to think about what artificial intelligence might mean for penal services like prisons and probation. I'm not going to say that I think they've got it all right, but at least they have done some important work. And anybody who wants to think about this further must at least start with this document. It makes 30 recommendations. It's got quite a lengthy appendix explaining the background to those recommendations. It wants to see AI used everywhere in relation to maintaining security and order in prisons through informing digital rehabilitation programs that offenders might experience in prison or on probation. But they emphatically say that they want to preserve the human interpersonal element, the relational element, to use David's words, in the supervision of offenders in the community, which is the essence of what probation has been about. And they qualify that only with a statement that says you can replace human interpersonal interaction in supervision only if it is necessary and proportional, right? So that might sound like they're taking a very restrictive approach to the use of AI and digital technologies in order to preserve the human, right? But it's not that restrictive, because they do take for granted, along the lines of the 4th Industrial Revolution, that AI is going to infuse every aspect of public service. Every aspect of public service will be data-driven. You will need artificial intelligence, software and hardware to manage all the data that is going to be gathered and processed in order to run government services. And to come back, they do say, yes, there's going to be a lot of AI recommendations, a lot of AI predictions about how the consumers and clients of public services will be working, but there'll always be, to use the jargon of the Council of Europe more generally, a human in the loop who monitors all the automated decisions that might be made. So in its own eyes, this document is full of safeguards, right? It's definitely saying AI is going to happen on a huge scale and we have to get used to it, but it's very confident that we can install the safeguards that will make it trustworthy and reliable and human-centric. However, I think it has certain limitations. Human rights are a wonderful thing, but they may not be sufficient as a form of ethics to protect and preserve some forms of professional labour. There is no human right against losing your job to automation, for example. And in the case of public services, whose human rights are we most thinking of here? Are we thinking of human rights of the professionals, or are we thinking of the human rights of the clients? And whose arguments will be dominant if we have to say the way to go forward is human rights? It doesn't guarantee that all interests will be served equally. The trouble with proportional and necessary is that they're very subjective, and I think they still allow a transformative degree of public sector innovation greater than the Council of Europe actually anticipate at this moment in time. Okay, we've still got a human in the loop, but is that human in the loop a probation officer, as we might have understood him or her to have been even 20 years ago? Is the human in the loop who monitors the automated decisions somebody completely different to a probation officer? And crucially, I think there is a misjudgment about where we're at in terms of the pervasiveness of artificial intelligence and the likely ways in which it will develop that the Council of Europe just don't take account of. I'm taking my cues here from a man called Mustafa Suleyman, who used to work for DeepMind, an AI company that led the revolution in the 2010s and now works for Microsoft. And he's a tech guy, but he's a very thoughtful tech guy. And he basically argues that the chances of restricting the further development and diffusion of artificial intelligence, given the context of surveillance capitalism, is highly unlikely, and that keeping it at the level at which the PCCP thinks it could be kept is therefore rather dubious, in my view, if Mustafa Suleyman is right about the pace and scope and degree of innovation that cannot be stopped, right? I mean, he doesn't even talk about regulating AI. He talks about the need to contain AI. It's a different word to regulation. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk much about prisons because there isn't time. I want to concentrate on probation, but just to give you one thing to think about in the questions they raise about AI in smart prisons is, what would you do if the technology was offered to you as a prison service? If you had people in solitary confinement, would you think it would be helpful to let them have personal digital companions, advanced Alexas, if you like, to modify their feelings of isolation and loneliness while they're in solitary confinement? Or would that actually make it more likely that you would use solitary confinement if you could humanize it with a device like that and give people an artificial friend while they were the hours? It's an interesting question. Next slide, please. So the interesting thing about the recommendation, the PCCP recommendation, is it does concede, right, that many tasks that we associate with probation could in fact be automated, right? There are fewer tasks in a prison that can be automated in their view, but there are many tasks in probation that could be automated, which is why there's very strong emphasis on preserving the human is so important, right? Now, the list of probation tasks that I've written down here are my list. It's my list, not theirs. They say that probation could easily be automated, but they're a bit vague on exactly what that might mean. But you don't have to think too hard about it if you're familiar with developments in advanced digital services as to what that might mean. Chatbots could easily be used for dialogue and counselling. These might be text-based or they might be voice-based. They might be linked on your mobile phone to an avatar of what your probation officer looks like as opposed to a real probation officer. But chatbots could do a lot of the dialogical and counselling work that probation officers currently undertake and already do in lots of private services, like finding your own AI boyfriend or responding to a company that has sold you some goods that you didn't like. Customer service has been a big arena in which the technology for chatbots have developed. Risk assessment, the holy grail for many probation services over the last 20 years, is already quite automated, but it uses only limited data, just a few variables, and you could increase massively the type of data and the type of variables you could add into an AI-driven risk assessment. And there are lots of publications in the world out about that already. So that would just be a logical extension of where automated risk assessment has already got to. And indeed, from my sense of the literature, it is the area where AI has been most talked about. Writing court reports is a significant probation task, but in the age of ChatGPT, with just a few useful pieces of information, that too can be easily automated, as we already automate sports and news reports. Delivering programs. Well, there's already a vast number of rehabilitation programs or mental health support programs online, which people can tap into, sometimes voluntary, sometimes on the recommendation of a therapist. And there are certainly plenty of companies who are marketing online rehabilitation programs to probation services who are willing to use them. And that may include programs that are delivered through virtual reality. And as you'll see in a minute, there's already some experiments going on about the use of virtual reality in probation. Through the use of electronic monitoring, probation services have been tracking offenders' locations, monitoring their movements for quite a long time. Yeah, there's certainly a movement to enrich that using smartphones and Fitbits, the health monitoring devices, the healthcare monitoring devices, to enrich and deepen that form of electronic monitoring, all doable by smartphones and wearable devices. Remote alcohol monitoring is something that can easily be done now. You can give people portable breathalyzers, and you can send them a text that says they have to breathalyze themselves in the next 5 minutes, and they can use their smartphone camera to monitor that they do it properly and that it is actually them who is blowing into the breathalyzer and not their sober friend. And probably none of these developments, if they started to take place incrementally, would be done without a dialogue with service users, with clients, right? But it's not obvious to me anymore that service users would be hostile to this. They might welcome automated service delivery and reduced interpersonal interaction, particularly if that interpersonal interaction is not of very good quality, if they don't really feel their probation officers are competent or caring or able to give them the time that they need. Next slide, please. There we are, probation and virtual reality. There's already experiments gone on using VR, not particularly sophisticated experiments, but they're going on, and who knows where that might lead to down the line. Tom Gash, a tech writer who writes quite a lot about crime, said in Wired a few years ago that, why not put people under house arrest with electronic monitoring, give them a curfew and tell them to do learning, like learn how to be a plumber in VR headsets, or maybe just make them sit in a VR device that makes them look at brick walls and replicates online what it might feel like to be in solitary confinement. This is not a good idea, but Tom Gash thinks of himself as a very progressive individual. And one of the things that people tend to forget about VR is that it generates a vast amount of data about the person's body and the person's mental operations that can be inferred from that. Is this really a vital development in the way we supervise offenders in the community? Or might this be called invasive technification, to coin a phrase that has been around in sociology of technology studies and philosophy of technology studies for a long time? Next slide, please. Now, probation always has changed. We can't say that, we want to put a block on every aspect of supervising offenders in the community and it never changing its form as the social and political and economic context changes. From its religious origins in the late 19th century to where it was even in the 1970s, probation was a very different activity. It became a wholly secular organization. It wasn't very tightly managed until the 1980s, and that is turning probation in government's eyes, whatever the profession itself thinks, or whatever the people in the profession think about why they went into the job and what they think they're doing. To governments, probation is a form of cost-efficient crime control, emphasis on control, emphasis on cost-efficient. And it's traditionally been a daytime human activity that requires a lot of relational skills and a strong ethic of care, plus always an element of control as well. But over the years, particularly since the 1980s, probation has become much less relational, more task-orientated, more tightly managed, more routinized, more controlling, and therefore easier to automate. Would the public care? Probably not very much, because probation has never had much public appreciation. And the current probation service in England and Wales is in a terrible state. It's underfunded, it's demoralised, it's inefficient, and it doesn't give good quality supervision. So if a hard-pressed government in the near future was offered by a major tech corporation a whole raft of cheaper operations, cheaper technical options that could accomplish all those core probation tasks with much less human input and do it at night as well as during the day, would this become something that was necessary and proportional in the government's eyes? And could anything that's written in this nice recommendation from the PCCP, could that actually prevent any of this happening? Next slide, please. And the thing about techno-populism, which is a cultural and political movement of some significance now, even if it's more obviously identified in the United States of America than here, but it's definitely a movement. And populist politics generally, since the turn of the century, have always been more punitive than liberal politics. They've been anti-rehabilitation, pro-suffering, pro-shaming, hateful, exclusionary. And the way in which governments have responded to the development of the probation service has already been damaging to the humanist ideals of the service because of these populist trends in wider politics. Now, technocracy was the opposite side of that. This is ruled by the experts and elites, and it's traditionally quite at odds with what the people want because they don't understand anything. They're ignorant. They're thick. They don't know what they want, but the experts do, and the experts can achieve goals, right? That nobody else, not even the liberal bureaucrats or the liberal professionals, the managerial technocrats, can get things done. They can be much more efficient in the way they run public services or run the government, right? But now we've got this fusion of technocracy and populism coming together, as I said earlier on. And I think the consequences of that, right, for something like the probation service is very significant. I think it will lead to a greater use of digital technology to further punitive ends. It will favor automation. We might well finish up with a worldview, a government view that sees offenders as unredeemable bad people who are fit only to be monitored by machines, unlike decent people who might deserve a bit more flexibility about the way they get to engage with AI and digital technologies. Next slide, please. So I think we need some selective resistance to this, and we need to find the resources on which we might base this resistance. And it has to be selective because there's no way that the continuing development of AI won't continue, won't proceed. But unless we find some way of resisting it in the probation service, if we value the probation service, we will have to find something stronger, I think, than this Council of Europe recommendation, or else otherwise probation will go the way of the lamplighter. And not all the points that I'm making there on the right-hand side are faith-based points, but I like to think that faith-based groups and people who have a faith to draw on, to reflect on how we respond at this present moment in time. I say that because that line by the Pope's advisor on AI, Paolo Benanti, what is the difference between a man who exists and a machine that functions? I'd have been happier if he'd have said person rather than man, but the point is the same. Do we think there is a significant difference between a person who exists and a machine that functions? And does that have any bearing on whether we should actually be getting close to automating probation? Not all the reflection on this is faith-based. That book, Human Flourishing in a Technological Society, is a mostly secular work, but it's all part of what we might need to draw on to develop the kind of things that we need to preserve probation if we set our minds to doing that. So we do need to resist the worldview of Silicon Valley, right? The idea that there are no limits to the degrees of innovation that might make the world more convivial for us. We don't want invasive technification to be normalized, to use the word that David used in his presentation as well. We don't want to be in a situation where we're thinking that this is just inevitable, right? That tech grades are always going to happen, whether it's in our phones or in our public services. And some of you might already be thinking, well, it's too late for any of that. It's too late. But like David, I don't want to think it is too late to find the resources to place some limits on what I think would be the bad aspects of rampant technological developments that rely on AI. And specifically in relation to probation, we do have a strong evidence base about humanistic best practice. There are many good things that can be accomplished by probation officers that don't rely particularly on digital technologies or AI more specifically. And we need to talk about what humanistic probation is capable of achieving. But if we are going to turn to one particular faith, there is an article in the current magazine Prospect, the English magazine Prospect, written by a man called Ethan Zuckerman, who has a monthly column about technological developments. And he suggested that in relation to AI, we should be more Amish, right? Because the Amish are very good at deliberating very carefully about what technologies they want to allow into their lives and their work. You know, it's a stereotype to say they don't use any modern technology. They do, but they use it much more carefully, much more thoughtfully, and much more minimally than is the case in the wider world. And translating from what the Amish do to what we might need to do, and particularly in the context of applying those kind of insights to probation, yes, that's going to be hard, but I like the caption, be more Amish. And I would like to think that faith groups could be a locus of resistance in responding to some of these general developments that David has talked about, as well as the specific one to do with probation that I did think would be of particular significance to Quakers in criminal justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Again, plenty to think about and much to do. So I'm now going to hand over to where is she?
Shani, hello.
Yeah, Sani,
Yeah.
who's going to manage the Q&A part, of which we don't have as much time as we thought, but we do have some time.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. What I suggest is that you, if you'd like to ask a question, that you use the electronic hand button, and I'll select you in turn. If you have a problem with that, then you can indicate in the chat that you want to ask a question, or indeed you could type your question into the chat and I'll read it out. And if you can also indicate whether your questions is for Mike or David, that would be, or either, that would be helpful as well. So I'm going to press on since we're short of time. I can see one question already from Owen. So Owen, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, thanks, Shani. Yeah, at JAAG, we've been noticing this phrase, human in the loop, for, well, 5 years since the beginning. And the more and more we see the way things are going, the question that arises is, to what extent can this be the panacea? To what extent do we see humans in the loop being competent, concerned, monitored, accountable? I wonder if either of the speakers have anything to say about this. Thanks.
David, I'd be interested in your views on the human in the loop.
Well, you know, it's an idea that originated in the tech world, not outside the tech world. And it originated with groups who are working in all kinds of areas that relate to machine learning, so-called, and artificial intelligence, to robotics and so on. So here at Queen's University, there's a lab where they are working on, well, a range of areas, and the people that run that lab discuss the humans in the loop business quite a lot. But while I think it sounds like a promising idea, well, maybe it is a promising idea. I am concerned both about the things that were just raised by the questioner, the background of the human that is in the loop, because frankly, for example, if it is just somebody else in the technical team who is the human in the loop, then that seems to me to be inadequate. We need people who are ethically informed, who are, it requires a degree of interaction and interdependence between those who are in the, whatever you like to call them, humanistic and social sciences, with those who are involved with AI. So, I see there's some scope for it, and I think that it's important to keep as a slogan, but an awful lot needs to be defined about it and about the those who are that voice before we can really trust it to be a means of making real progress in the direction that our discussions have been going this afternoon.
Thank you. So next we have a question from Melanie, and after that we have a question from Peter, but we'll take them individually. Melanie.
This is probably more angled at Mike. I mean, I agree that the relationship aspect of probation should be paramount, but at the moment we have an impoverished, underfunded probation service that can't rise to the challenge that set it, and that is often little more than a risk management service. So what is the chance that it will be properly funded, properly respected and built up again? Because we seem to be such a long way from that at the moment.
Yes, okay, well, thank you, Melanie. How interesting that you should ask me that question, because, I mean, there have been very few signs since the probation service was reunified in 2021, having been partly privatised and then brought back into a single state organisation, which is part of the prison service. There have been very few signs since 2021, when that happened, that there is any political incentive to improve the quality of the probation service. I mean, all the public focus has been on the crisis in prisons, but there is an equally strong crisis in probation as well. And I don't see any sign in the present government either that they want to make any effort even to restore the probation service to some approximation to what it was at its best in the 1990s. In fact, I see the very opposite trend in the current sentencing review, which is supposed to help the government move forward on the crisis of prisons and probation. There is a dramatic emphasis on let's find technological solutions in that sentencing review, which I think point in the very opposite direction to restoring the humanistic best of the probation service.
Thank you. And next we have Peter.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your talk and your direct call to action to be resistive. This is, clearly the march of the machines. I can see the natural response to that. In my background with industrial safety, you actually managed to create a collaboration between industry and a regulator and move things forward. We did that with forklift trucks. And I'm seeing a similar kind of situation needed with online safety, trying to find a collaboration, a way of working with the people that are creating machines, because I just sense my experience is if we resist them all the time, they'll just find a workaround and things might get worse. I'd be interested on your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think David would have some interesting thoughts about that as well. Yes, I think that collaboration between the innovators and the regulators is, in general terms, where a lot of this debate is at the moment. Can we get a constructive relationship between the two? I mean, the document, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, actually uses the phrase innovation-led regulation, which in some people's minds that would be oxymoronic, right? But that, nonetheless, that is the phrase around which they build the idea of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So yes, if we can get some collaboration between innovators and regulators, this is something that the Council of Europe is very strong on. It isn't particularly evident in the document about probation and prisons, but as a general theme in the Council of Europe, getting the two sides to cooperate is a hallmark of their thinking. My response to that in relation to probation and criminal justice is that is far easier said than done, because I don't think it's ever going to be even-handed if the government loses confidence in having a humanistic probation service at all, right? Preserving that service in the face of all the innovations that could displace it would be very difficult, no matter what regulators were trying to do. But David, have you got a view on collaborations between innovators and regulators?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't want to limit it to collaboration between regulators and innovators, but a broader kind of collaboration, I think, is called for in all sorts of areas. For many years, I was involved with the Federal Privacy Commissioner in Canada, which is your equivalent is the Information Commissioner. And I think there were some fruitful things that came out of that, but it was always limited by what government bureaucrats can say in certain circumstances, how they can respond. So the limits of their remit are limits on those that collaborate with them as well. So I think it's a place for resistant activities, just as there is for collaboration. And I wouldn't want anything that I say to be seen as merely resistant. I think there is an important role for collaboration, and it befits those who, work out of faith positions to show that in the way that they do the collaboration and the resistance. So I think there's a space for both and of course it's always going to depend on the context. If it's beyond a regulator to be working with an agency that is promoting some new development, then the possibilities might be a lot more open than just working with a regulator.
Thank you. Now, Marion had a comment on this point, but I've noticed we're virtually out of time. So I'm going to hand across to Marion, because you might want to make a final comment on this point, and perhaps then.
Yes, I think I'll have to ask my question of the two people, our speakers, separately, because we are out of time. I think unless there's anything absolutely vital, I'm going to just say a few closing comments. So is there anybody who's absolutely burning to say something before we do that? Okay, well, I want to thank both our speakers very much indeed for their enlightening presentations and getting us all to think really hard about these topics. And to say thank you very much to both of them. The recording of this webinar will be on the Quakers in Criminal Justice website at some point in the very near future. So if you want to see it again, then please go there. And again, if you have any sort of further queries, please please contact. There was going to be an email in the chat. Is that
It's there.
It's
is that
there.
there? Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that's right. So please email Paul with any queries. And obviously there'll probably be next steps, and they will be in the newsletters that Quakers in Criminal Justice produce, and obviously in the newsletters which the Just Algorithms Action Group produce. And so if you want to receive any of those, then please join up with either or both organisations and sort of join the conversation. So I think, without any further ado, I'd like to wish you all well and good thinking. And thank you very much for attending this webinar.
Marion, I'd just like to say about it appearing on the QICJ website. It's simply www.qiCJ.org/events, and you will see the event advertised there. So next week, our webmaster will put it up in that slot. So it's simply the Quakers in Criminal Justice under events, and you'll see it there. Thank you.
And may I add that you're more than welcome to email me. I've put my email in the chat, and you're welcome to email me if you did have a question that you were frustrated by the time limit on our conversation.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. Very interesting.
Okay. We're all signing out now. We're saying goodbye
Yes.
and signing out. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye now.